Good day, everyone. I am Desiree Legaspi from BSBA HRM 2A. So, in this video, we will talk about or we will explain about the employer-employee relationship together with Miss Erica Labayog and Miss Jenny Joy Garcia. The employer-employee relationship is the legal and practical connection between an employer and an employee characterized by mutual obligations. The employer provides work and compensation, and the employee performs services under the employer's control. In statutory terms, an employee is any person employed by an employer, and the existence of this relationship confers rights to minimum wage, security of tenure, and social welfare benefits. According to the Department Order Number 147 to 15 of Section 3, the employer-employee relationship is to ascertain the existence of an employer-employee relationship. The fourfold test shall apply. Number one is the selection and engagement of the employee. Number two, the payment of wages. Number three, the so-called control test. The so-called control test is commonly regarded as the most crucial and determinative indicator of the presence or absence of an employer-employee relationship. Under the control test, an employer-employee relationship exists where the person for whom the services are performed and reserves the right to control not only the end achieved, but also the manner and means used to achieve that end.
The purpose of employer and employee relationship test is to determine if a client who claims to be an employee and the company that denies this relationship have a relationship. A person's job status may be disputed for a number of reasons, including contract, faculty contracting, misclassification, labor law infraction. In cases where there is a disagreement over whether the parties have an employer and employee relationship, the court applies two standards which are follow as the fourfold test and the socio-economic evaluation. So let's start with the fourfold test. We have four. First is the selection and engagement of employee, payment of wages, power of dismissal, and power of control. Selection and engagement of the employee. This refers to how the worker was hired and who selected or engaged them for a job. It is the employer who selected and engaged, hires an employee, as in a result of employer is the one who started and hiring the recruitment process, which included finding candidates for posting job openings or advertisement, evaluating and interviewing prospects, and ultimately signing them to an employment contract. Although it may seem odd to call attention to all obvious, this criteria is the place because it frequently gets broken, especially when the third party is involved, as in case of contracts and subcontracts. Second is the payment of wages. This refers to who pays the worker for their services and how the compensation is given. It is the employer who pays the employee's wages or salaries. Accordingly, the employer prepares for the payment system such as payroll or payslip as a proof of payment to the employee. However, it should be pointed out that the fact that the employee's name does not appear in the payroll and the envelope record submitted by the employer negate the existence of employer and employee relationship. For the payroll to be utilized, to disprove the employment of a person, it must be contain a true and complete list of employee. The third one is the power of dismissal. This refers to the employer's authority to terminate worker services with or without cause as allowed by the law. It is only the employer who can dismiss an employee. One of the disciplinary measures that the employer may take against a negligent worker for infraction that qualify as the amount to a just cause is dismissal. Likewise, an employer have the authority to terminate an employee for legitimate reasons as long as it affects the employee's received separation money. The company would not have the authority to fire someone if there's no employer and employer relationship between the parties, such as under the freelancer or the independent contractor arrangement. Rather, a company choices or restricted to a ground for contract revocation or termination due to the breach of contract. The last one is the power of control or the control test. This is the most crucial element in determining an employer and employee relationship. It refers to the employer's power to control not just the result of the work, but also the means and method used in achieving it. In an employment relationship, the employer has the active supervision and control of their employees who are doing the job, work, or service. This is the natural and logical consequences considering the employer responsible and liable for the actions of their employees' performance of their work. In addition, the dictating and ultimate product of employer must have the authority to a specific how, when, and where the work is completed. These aspects is supported if the employee is bound in the business policies, schedule, codes of conduct, and performance measure. This is what sets an independent contractor apart from the employee who often has the more control over how the task is completed. So after the fourfold test, we move into the economic reality test. Aside from the control test, the Supreme Court has also used the economic reality test in determining whether the employer and employee relationship exists between the parties. Under this test, the economic realities prevailing with the activity or between the parties are examined into a consideration of totality of circumstances surrounding the true nature of the relationship between the parties. This is especially approached when, as in this case, there is no written agreement or contract on which to base the relationship. In our jurisdiction, the benchmark of economic reality is analyzing the possible employment relationship for purposes of applying the labor code owed to the economic dependence of the worker on his employer. Burden of proof refers to the obligation of a party to show proof to establish a claim. It shifts between the employer and employee depending on what being claimed. So in a burden of proof, we have two, the monetary claims and the legal dismissal. So in monetary claims, burden of proof is on the employer. If the claims refers to those incurred in the normal course of businesses, as opposed to those are not, such as requiring overtime work or mandating work in a holiday, rest day, or a special non-working day. So let me give you one example of this. So Carlos says that he worked 10 hours of overtime last month and wasn't paid. Burden of proof, since overtime is not a regular, Carlo must prove that, or anyone with timesheet or witness, that he worked extra hours and wasn't paid. For illegal dismissal, burden of proof is on the employer to show that the dismissal was valid unless the employer denies the very fact of dismissal, in which cases the burden of proof is shifted to the employee to prove that she has been dismissed. For example, Rosa was fired and filed a case. The employer admits firing her. Burden of proof, the employer must prove that Rosa was fired for a valid legal reason, like theft, dishonesty, and etc.
Piercing the corporate veil in employer and employee relationship. Piercing the corporate veil in legal doctrine used to disregard the separate juridical personality of a corporation, allowing courts to hold its shareholders, directors, or officer personally liable for corporate obligations in the context of labor law and employee relationship. These principles is applied to protect employees from potential abuses of corporate form that deprive them of their rights or benefit under the law. One is the general rule. Corporate entity as a separate personality under the Philippine law, a corporation is a juridical entity distinct and separate from its stockholders, directors, or officers. It has its own rights, obligations, and liabilities. This principle is a fundamental to corporate law and shields stakeholders from personal liability for corporate acts. However, when a corporation is used as a shield to perpetuate fraud, defeat labor laws, and evade legitimate obligations to employees, courts may pierce the corporate bail. Second one is the grounds for piercing the corporate bail. In labor cases, the doctrine is invoked under specific circumstances where justice and equity demand holding individuals or other entities liable. The Supreme Court has constantly held that the corporate bail may be pierced when the corporation is used as a cloak to cover fraud or illegal acts, an alter ego or instrumentality to defeat public convenience, justify a wrong or perpetuate injustice, a vehicle to invade existing labor laws and obligations. The third one is application in employer and employee relations. In labor disputes, piercing the corporate bail is applied to ensure that workers are not denied their rights. Due to the misissue of the corporate structure, it is commonly invoked in cases involving the non-payment of wages, benefits, or the separation pay, illegal dismissal cases where the corporation was used to avoid liabilities. Labor-only contracting or schemes where employers use a corporation or juridical entity to evade employer obligations. Closely held corporation where shareholders dominate corporate affairs, making it indistinguishable from the owners. The fourth one is The fourth one is test for piercing the corporate bail. To pierce the corporate bail, courts apply specific tests. For example, is the control test, which determines whether there is a such unity of interest and ownership that separates personality of the corporation and its owner cease to exist. The second one is fraud test, establishes whether the corporate entity was used to commit fraud or a wrongful act. The under the capitalization test examines if the corporation is inadequately financed to meet its obligations, indicating bad faith in its formation. Fourth is a test for piercing the corporate bail. To pierce the corporate bail, courts apply specific tests. The first test is control test. Determines whether is such unity of interest of ownership that the separate personalities of the corporation and its owners cease to exist. Next one is the fraud test. Establishes whether the corporate entity was used to commit fraud or a wrongful act. Last one is the undercapitalization. Examines if the corporation is inadequately financed to meet its obligation, indicating bad faith in its formation. Is a key principle and jurisprudence. According to Villanueva v. Andre, 2016, the Supreme Court ruled that the piercing the corporate bail may be used when a corporation is established to defeat an employee's claim for wages or benefits. In Dole Apex Mining 2008, these cases emphasize that corporate layering or interlocking directors cannot be used to evade liabilities. In Alvarez Golden Trike Block Incorporation 2018, the doctrine was applied when the corporate form was used to perpetuate fraud and circumvent labor laws holding the individual owners personally liable. 6 is the due process in piercing the corporate bail. Before the corporate bail is pierced, these are the following must be established. The first one is the evidence of fraud or bad faith in the use of corporate entity. The second one is proof of intertwining of corporate and personal interests. The third one is the failure to comply with labor laws by the entity hiding behind the corporation separation. Courts exercise this power cautiously and only when these are clear and convincing evidence. 7 is the effects of piercing the corporate bail. The first one is personal liability. Shareholders, directors, or officers may be held personally liable for corporate debts or obligations to employees, expanded accountability, or other entities in a corporate group like parents, subsidiary, or affiliates may also be held liable if they were found complicit in the evasion of labor obligations. Next one is the restoration of employee rights. Employees may recover unpaid wages, benefits, or even damages directly from the responsible individuals or entities. Last one is the protection of employees' rights. This principle is equitable remedy to ensure that the workers' rights are not defeated by the unscrupulous employers. Courts are vigilant in labor cases, as the law mandates that all doubts in labor disputes be resolved in favor of labor. It is according to Article 4 in Labor Code of the Philippines. Involving television broadcasters. The legal framework governing television broadcasters in employer and employer relations in the Philippines is a nuisance intersection of labor law. Principles and specific considerations for broadcasting industry, key cases and regulations revolve around issues such as classifications of workers, employment, contracts, regulations, and compliance with the labor standards. Key issues in employer and employee relations in televisions broadcasting these classifications of workers. Regular employees versus independent contractors. Television broadcasters often engage individuals as talents, anchors, hosts, or performers under different employment arrangements as a frequent issues in whether these individuals are employees or independent contractors. Fourfold test courts apply the following determine the nature of the relationship. The first one is selection and engagement of the workers. Second one is the payment of wages. Third is the power of control. And next is a power of dismissal. The control test most significant factor in the employer's control over the means and methods by which the work is performed. For example, is Mike Salsa versus ABS-CBN Broadcasting Corporations under GR number 138051 in the month of June, day 10, in year 2004. Mike Sonsa, a television host, was determined to be an independent contractor and not an employee. The court emphasized the absence of control by ABS-CBN over the means and methods of his work. These are the talents of contracts. The first one is fixed-term contracts. Broadcasters often engage talents under fixed-term contracts, which is specifically the duration and nature of the engagement. Courts examine whether the use of fixed-term contracts is a means of circumvent labor law and protections. These landmark cases is Kaong versus Broadcasting Corporation ng ABS-CBN in GR number 2060-72 in January 28, year 2015. The Supreme Court upheld the validity of a fixed-term contract provided that the term was agreed upon the voluntary and term was no subterfuge to invade security of tenure regulation. Employees in televisions broadcasting who perform activities necessarily or desirable in the usual business or trade of the employer may acquire regular employment status. In relevant cases, the Capital Viruses Incorporation versus the Sec of Labor and Employment. This GR number, according to 96604, in July 12, 1991. Workers perform regular functions essential to the employer's business even under a different designations can be deemed a regular employees. Labor standards compliance, working hours, and the compensations. Employees are entitled to statutory benefits such as overtime pay, holiday pay, and the night shift differentials unless they fall under the exempted categories. For example, is the managerial employees. The talent fees and wages dispute often arise over whether the talent fees constitute wages under the labor code if the fee represents the compensation for labor law and services, it is considered as a wage. Next is the control and supervision. The extent of control over the broadcaster's work schedules, outputs, and deliverables is vital in establishing employer and employee relationships. Broadcaster may argue artistic freedom and creative autonomy to avoid being classified as employees, while the employers may assert managerial prerogative dismissal and security of tenure. The grounds for termination, the same principles is just an authorization causes apply to employees in the television industry, constructive dismissal, changes in work condition, such as reassignment to lesser roles or significant reductions in pay can lead to constructive dismissal claims. For example, is the Austria v. National Labor Relations Commission in GR number 124382, year August 16, 1999. An employee resigned to a role inconsistent. Drafting talents contracts. Contracts must clearly stipulate terms, including the nature of engagement, compensations, and the extent of control, to avoid ambitious term that can lead to a presumptions of regular employment in human resource policies. Broadcasters should implement policies that designate the rights and responsibilities of talents versus employees' compliance with the labor standards. Ensures that both talents and employees receive statutory benefits when applicable to avoid illegal disputes. This documentary evidence maintain detailed records of work, arrangements and communications and agreements to substantiate claims regarding the nature and relationship.
The examples of employer-employee relationships with the fourfold test is like this. For example, an officer manager working for a company exemplifies an employment relationship under the fourfold test because the employer exercises control over their schedule and tasks, provides a fixed monthly salary with the mandatory benefits such as SSS and PhilHealth, supplies necessary tools like a company, laptop, and software, and integrates the manager into core operations by entrusting them with critical HR and payroll responsibilities. Similarly, a restaurant chef hired by a restaurant owner meets the fourfold test criteria. The chef works fixed shifts following the owner's instructions, earns hourly wage with tax deductions, uses kitchen equipment owned by the restaurant, and directly contributes to the business's success through menu quality and customer satisfaction. The examples of employer-employee relationships without the fourfold test is like this. A freelance graphic designer does not meet the fourfold test. They retain control over their work, hours, and creative process. Are paid per project, use their own tools like a personal computer and design software, and are hired temporarily for specific tasks rather than being integrated into the client's long-term business strategy. The other example is a Grab food delivery partner operates independently. They choose their working hours and delivery routes, earn income per delivery without fixed benefits, provide their own motorcycle and smartphone, and have no role in Grab's operational decisions or company planning. So that's all for today's video. Thank you for watching.